I think we can all agree that Apple's operating system is quite beautiful. The user interface is very smooth and lightweight, everything looks so calm, perfect for a programmer who pulled an all-nighter. But then you check the price and suddenly everything feels less smooth. So some people eventually thought, what if I could run macOS on my normal non-Apple computer? Well, you actually can, not officially. Apple doesn't allow it, but technically, yes. That's where Hackintosh comes in. The name comes from Macintosh, the original line of Apple computers from the 80s. Combine Macintosh with hack and you get Hackintosh. Well, it's not hacking in the criminal sense, it's more like forcing macOS to run on hardware it wasn't designed for. Basically, Hackintosh is what happens when Apple says, you can't do that, and the internet collectively replies, watch me. Now let's get into what actually makes this possible, and why it's so hard. Apple builds macOS expecting a very controlled environment. Let's break down a few components it depends on. Chipsets. A chipset is a set of controllers on the motherboard that manage communication between the CPU, memory, storage, and peripherals. Apple expects specific chipsets with predictable behavior. GPUs. These are processors specialized in rendering graphics. macOS supports only certain AMD and older Intel GPUs. Many common PC GPUs, especially modern NVIDIA cards, are not supported at all. USB controllers. These control how USB ports behave. macOS expects specific controller types. Mismatched controllers can break USB ports entirely. Wi-Fi and Bluetooth modules. Apple only supports a small set of wireless chips. Most PC Wi-Fi cards, especially MediaTek's and Realtek, just don't work. Because PCs use a huge variety of hardware combinations, macOS has no built-in support for most of them. For many years, Apple used Intel processors, the same architecture found in most PCs. Intel CPUs uses the x86-64 instruction set. macOS already supported this architecture, so macOS could run on PC hardware if you could make the rest of the system look Apple-like. That opened the door for the Hackintosh community. macOS cannot boot directly on a PC. It expects Apple firmware and hardware identifiers. That's why Hackintosh uses special bootloaders like OpenCore. It does things like inject drivers. Drivers are programs that allow the operating system to communicate with hardware components. macOS needs special drivers called KEXTs to understand non-Apple hardware. Patch ACPI tables. ACPI is a system that describes power management, sleep-wake behavior, and hardware layout. PCs often have ACPI structures that macOS doesn't understand, so OpenCore corrects them. Spoof hardware information. It makes the system pretend to be a real Mac model so the OS behaves as expected. Map USB ports. macOS requires a precise USB mapping, otherwise many ports won't work. OpenCore's job is basically make this PC look like a Mac long enough for macOS to run. Even with OpenCore, hardware compatibility depends on drivers. Wi-Fi and Bluetooth. Most PC wireless chips do not have macOS drivers. MediaTek chips have zero support. Audio codecs. Codecs are chips that processes audio input and output. Some work with patches, others don't. Trackpads. Many work only partially. Gestures, clicking, or accuracy may be inconsistent. GPUs. Modern NVIDIA cards, not supported at all. AMD cards, generally support. Intel integrated graphics, depends on the generation. That's why compatibility checkers like OpenCore Simplifier are so important. Alright, now let's talk about the real question. Should you even bother installing a Hackintosh? Because yes, it works. But there's a difference between works and works without you regretting your life choices. First advantage, it's much cheaper than buying a real Mac. A Hackintosh lets you run macOS without selling a kidney. Second, performance can be excellent on compatible hardware. If your CPU, GPU, and chipset line up with what macOS supports, the system can actually run really well. Third, if you're curious about macOS, Xcode, or building apps for iPhone and Mac, Hackintosh is a cheap and effective way to get started. Fourth, you get more customization than an actual Mac. Real Macs are intentionally locked down. Limited hardware, limited upgrades. On a Hackintosh, you can choose your components, upgrade whatever you want. First disadvantage, systems updates can break everything. A normal Mac user sees an update and clicks install. Hackintosh user sees an update and starts praying. Sometimes updates work fine, sometimes they delete your Wi-Fi, your audio, your GPU acceleration, or your sanity. Second, Hardware compatibility is unpredictable. You can have two PCs with almost identical parts, and one will work perfectly while the other refuses to boot for reasons nobody understands. It's like macOS has personal preferences. Third, Wi-Fi and Bluetooth often require replacing your wireless card. Most PC Wi-Fi chips are simply not supported by macOS, so unless you enjoy using Ethernet forever, you will likely need to buy a compatible card, assuming your laptop even lets you replace it. Now let me tell you about my own Hackintosh attempt, because of course I tried it. I mean, who looks at their laptop and doesn't think, yeah, I should definitely install an unauthorized operating system on this thing. So I ran my Acer Aspire 5 through the Open Core Compatibility Checker, which is basically a program that tells you whether your laptop will happily run macOS or immediately burst into flames. Here's what I found. The CPU, totally compatible. The GPU, compatible too, although I don't have a dedicated one. Audio, compatible. Ethernet, compatible. I can use my cable to use the internet. And then we get to Wi-Fi. Wi-Fi was completely incompatible. Most laptops use Wi-Fi chips that macOS doesn't support. Mine was no exception. Bluetooth, also incompatible, which makes sense because many Wi-Fi Bluetooth modules use the same unsupported chipset. So after all of that, what was my conclusion? Yes, the laptop would boot macOS, but I'd basically end up with a MacBook that has the energy of a retired office printer. No Wi-Fi, no Bluetooth, a confused trackpad probably, and sleep mode that works only on national holidays. So yeah, technically possible, practically not worth sacrificing half of the features that make a laptop a laptop. Hackintosh is fun, educational, and surprisingly powerful when everything lines up. It's for people who enjoy experimenting, tweaking, fixing unexpected problems, and learning how operating systems really work. And hey, maybe after watching this video you'll be curious enough to try it, or maybe not. You have a brain.